So for number 10 for Throwback Thursday for my favourite albums, I've mentioned different ideas of things which are ranging from pop. There's also musicians which are funk, there's soul, there's a lot of what I call bedroom producing, where people have produced stuff on their own in studios. And I haven't actually mentioned a group yet either, but a lot of this is always about working with ideas of sound design and so forth. So this album, which I'm going to mention, was probably very influential to sound design in the 60s, and though their main successful album was probably more known to be such an epic piece, I think this album was actually more influential. So if you're British, and to be honest the most successful group of all time was these group guys. Four guys from Liverpool called the Beatles, and this is my favourite album of them, called Revolver. As you can see, this is shows sort of the idea of 1966, the idea of where it would obviously go into more psychedelic ideas. But Revolver by the Beatles, to me, is their best album. The other albums before this were mainly singles based, and then their album after this, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which as an album was their most successful album, but I actually don't think the songs are as good or as catchy. So I think Revolver sort of is just the pivot in between the singles of their albums and not really complete album works to this album, which I think was their most complete album. So when we're talking about pop music in the 60s, we can talk about many different artists, but the Beatles were probably person for classic pop songs, unconventional arrangements for that time, and some of the most classic pop songs ever written. And unfortunately, when you're growing up, you're always brainwashed. The Beatles are great, great musicians, great, and blah blah blah. And okay, I don't get everything about the Beatles. I don't think they're the best singers for a start. However, there is some great songs by the Beatles. So I'm going to go through some of these. So Taxman was written by George Harrison. It was about the political debate about at the time in the 60s that when the Beatles were working, if you actually earned so much money, they would charge you tax of 90%. So that's why this song was about Taxman. And George Harrison wrote a lot of political, social songs. Obviously, we'll talk about that when he releases his first album, All Things Must Pass, later on in this series. But Taxman, George Harrison's the lead singer, and it's like a funk song. It's not like... you can tell that it's the bridging the gap between Rubber Soul and the idea of Paperback Writer and all that sort of heavy sort of rock guitar sound. But this was actually like a funk song for the Beatles, and very great song politically, but also got great rhythms, very catchy. And then the second song, written by Paul McCartney, is Eleanor Rigby. Now, Eleanor Rigby is a tale about a lonely woman, which Paul McCartney saw in a graveyard in Liverpool. He claims he never, but they proved it as of later times. And Father Mackenzie is the one that does the sermons, and it's based on that idea. So again, he come up with this sort of narrative tale. Also very interesting because there wasn't any other arrangements apart from a string octet and just Paul McCartney singing. There's no other instrumentation. So quite understandably quite classic in its approach and minimalistic. So with Eleanor Rigby, probably one of probably Britain's best pop songs. Then we've got a couple of other ideas. So Lennon with his sort of more left field ideas, I'm Only Sleeping. Love You Too with George Harrison's got this idea of them using their sound of being going to India, to Rishikesh, where they learnt from the Maharishi, and they brought that influence back. So this is where they're starting getting their Indian influences, and obviously George Harrison learnt the sitar. They also got tabla players in, and they started creeping into their music some of the ideas of tonals and tritones and so forth. Then you've got Here, There and Everywhere by Paul McCartney, which is probably one of the greatest love songs in the 60s. Something by George Harrison I think is better, which was On the Abbey Road, but Here, There and Everywhere is a beautiful song. It's actually Paul McCartney writing it to Jane Asher, who was his girlfriend at the time. Yellowsubmarine, as we know, is probably not one of the best songs in the world, but it is also very much Ringo Starr's lead vocal, and it's also leads to a film called Yellowsubmarine, which was an animation film for a band, which was unusual. Nobody had really done that at the time. So Yellowsubmarine actually does follow Revolver a bit later on. The Yellowsubmarine was this idea of kind of a weird concept, kind of bit surreal, and I think also it was done for children as well. She Said by Lennon, again, really good song. Good Day Sunshine on Starting Side 2 was very upbeat, so again, sort of where the Beatles just again kept using their ideas from previous records, what they'd heard, and then just putting them so that they could always balance with this unusualness of the left field, what they're experimenting on. It also stopped touring as well, so they could work solely in the studio, and this is the first album they do this where they didn't tour to support it, so they had more time in the studio. Dr. Robert is about a guy who actually dropped LSD in their tea, and how that was their first experience of that. Got to Get You Into My Life, which you may have heard is written by Paul McCartney. I don't know Lennon McCartney, but he did write it. And actually there's a version of it in Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which is a great, better version than this version is by Earth, Wind and Fire. Got to Get You Into My Life, it's got these horns, kind of this very old school English idea of jazz and so forth. And then Tomorrow Never Knows, the last track of side 2, is an avant-garde idea where he gets the reverse guitars and so forth, and basically John Lennon wanted to be a guru in the Himalayas and have this kind of very surreal idea. And I think it kind of leads right into where Sgt. Pepper's goes, because it's showing that they wanted to go into this new direction. But the one thing I think Revolver does, it restrains that over complications and avant-garde, because when it got to like Sgt. Pepper's, and the worst I think personally is the White Album, where it's just overindulgent rubbish. I know people like the White Album, there's some good stuff like Blackbird and stuff, but there's a lot of shit on that album. I just don't like that album at all. I think it's very hard listen. You know, you get Oobla Dee Oobla Da, and then you got some shit like Piggies on it. It's just a horrible album. So where Revolver, I think what it does, it just reins all the Beatles' creativity in, and I think it's such a solid album. And I think it actually was their biggest selling album until Sgt. Pepper's took it over. And so for me, I think with the Beatles, their influence and what they did in music and songwriting techniques and recording techniques, this album I do rate very highly. And I think it's, to me, if anybody wants to listen to the Beatles, instead of just listening to the greatest hits, if you want to listen to one of their best albums, 1966, Revolver, I'd highly recommend. Plus, also with Revolver, it's actually when the Beatles were actually getting on. Whereas when you get to some of the other albums, you can hear where a lot of the egos happen a lot in that group. I think Sgt. Pepper's is where it really started happening a lot. Some of the stuff, production-wise, is just, I don't know. I'm just not a fan of Sgt. Pepper's. I think there's some good stuff on it, but Revolver to me is a more solidified album. And then I think when they were getting ready to end, Abbey Road to me is then the next best thing. But I think with Abbey Road there's some weak songs on it, and it's why I don't rate it as high as Revolver. But I think also I find that George Harrison as a songwriter actually was really becoming more equal par to Lennon and McCartney, and I think his ego wasn't so large. So I think Abbey Road has that, and I think some of the Here Comes the Sun and Something on that album I think are the best songs, and they're written by George Harrison. Whereas I think some of the Beatles songs by McCartney and Lennon were not as strong, and I think their friendship and the camaraderie in the band had really disintegrated by that time, by 1969. So there's a difference from 1966 to 69, that 3 years, it was quite intense. And I think with the Revolver, that to me is their last peak of where the group are getting on. That's why I love the album, anyway.